Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at both Rogue One and Solo. Since Solo never got a sequel and it's unlikely that we will ever see Solo 2, I figured it was fair to lump it in with Rogue One since they both share the exact same banner of a Star Wars story. These were the first Star Wars movies to not really be mainline episodic movies that The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi were. They are both standalones. So the question being, how do both movies stack up with the rest of the Star Wars movies? Now, before we get started, make sure to follow the blog, MetrObeliskradio.blogspot.com, where you can get all of the updates related to MetrObelisk Radio. With that out of the way, let's get right into Rogue One and Solo. So we're going to start this off with Rogue One, and as always, we start by looking at the creative team. Now, this movie was directed by Gareth Edwards, and his only movie directing credits before this were Monster and the 2014 reboot of Godzilla. Now, we do know that Tony Gilroy was brought in to handle all of the reshoots, but how much was done in the reshoots? Does the final product represent a Gareth Edwards movie or a Tony Gilroy movie? Gareth Edwards was supposed to direct Godzilla King of the Monsters after this, but decided to drop out, and no one knows why he did that at that time. But my theory is because of all the behind-the-scenes drama that he dealt with on this movie is the reason why he dropped out of directing the Godzilla sequel. So let's talk about Tony Gilroy's directing credits, because who knows how much involvement he had. His directing credits only include 3 movies: Michael Caine with George Clooney, Duplicity with Julia Roberts and Clive Owen, and The Bourne Legacy with Jeremy Renner. Now let's move on to the writers, and let's start with Tony Gilroy once again. He was one of the main writers on this. His writing credits include The Bourne Identity, Bourne Supremacy, Bourne Ultimatum, State of Play with Russell Crowe, The Great Wall with Matt Damon, and Beirut that movie that came out in 2018. Then we have Chris Weitz, and his writing credits include the movie adaptation of The Golden Compass, the 2015 reboot of Cinderella, and The Mountain Between Us with Idris Elba and Kate Winslet. Then we have John Knoll, and this movie is his only writing credit. He actually works in the visual effects department. And the final writer on this movie is Gary Widda. Now, his writing credits include The Book of Eli, After Earth, and 4 episodes of Star Wars Rebels. But he also worked as a writer for video games, and he wrote the games Prey from the 2006 game, Telltale's The Walking Dead, Seasons 1, 2, and the final season, and the original Back to the Future Part 2 video game from 1990. Now we move on to the character analysis portion of Rogue One, and we'll start off with Felicity Jones as Jyn Erso. She's the daughter of the MacGuffin in this movie that doesn't want to join the rebellion but is forced to, and that's basically all she is. Then we get to Diego Luna as Cassian Andor, and this character is a contradiction not to just the rebels in Star Wars, but even to himself. In the beginning, he kills a contact because they get caught, and the contact can't climb a wall because of a broken arm. But when he needed to kill Galen Erso later in the movie, he simply just couldn't pull the trigger. It comes across as, hey kids, look at how edgy we are, and then immediately backpedaling to give this character a moral compass. Then we get to Alan Tudyk as K2SO. Now, he's the most human character in this movie, and the issue with that is K2SO is a droid. If the audience cries over a droid's death instead of a human character's death, you've got yourself a real problem with these characters. Then we get Donnie Yen as Chirrut Imwe. Now, he's one of the Guardians of the Whills. It is shown that he's force sensitive, but it's only shown off in one scene. Then we get Wen Jiang as Baze Malbus. Now, he was Chirrut Imwe's partner in terms of the Guardians of the Whills, and for those who don't remember, he was the guy with a really big machine gun on his back. Then we have Ben Mendelsohn as Krennic, and he's just an irredeemable villain in this movie. They give him a couple of kick-the-dog moments that I'll get into in the narrative portion in just a minute. We then have Forrest Whitaker as Saw Gerrera. Now, I know that this wasn't his first appearance in Star Wars. Saw Gerrera's first appearance was the 5th season of Star Wars The Clone Wars. If you just look at him in this movie, he's just a rebel who went rogue and takes a radical approach to the conflict that doesn't align with the main rebel alliance. Then we have Riz Ahmed as Bodhi Rook. Now, he was the defector in this movie. He was a pilot that was sent to find Saw Gerrera by Galen Erso. And finally, we end up with Mads Mikkelsen as the one, the only, the MacGuffin, Galen Erso. Now, he was the chief architect of the Death Star who became the MacGuffin later on. Now let's get into the narrative analysis of Rogue One, and the plot for this movie was simple. It was basically how the rebels acquired the plans for the Death Star that were in the original movie. The problem with this is this story has already been told. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the first level in the video game Star Wars Dark Forces. Now, what this movie did was it basically wrote out Kyle Katarn, who was a fan-favorite character from the old expanded universe, before Disney just on a whim decided that it was no longer canon, but they constantly steal from it and claim it as their own, and a perfect example of that is Thrawn in Star Wars Rebels. Now, let's start at the beginning of this movie. Galen Erso is living on a farm with his wife and daughter. Krennic shows up and wants him to come back to work on the Death Star. Galen says no, and Jin and his wife run, but the wife runs back and gets killed. Jin hides, big whoop-de-doo. Now, what makes this plot point moot is Galen ends up going with Krennic anyway, even though Krennic killed his wife, and Galen thinks that he killed his daughter on top of it. But fuck it, I'll go with the guy anyway. Now, after this, there's a very significant time jump, and Jin is in prison, and the rebels bust her out and force her to join them against her will because they need her to get to Saw Gerrera. Now, this is the first part of this is where the first part of the movie really starts. There's 3 distinct parts to this narrative, but let's just talk about the first part before jumping to the end too quickly. The first part of this movie is find Saw Gerrera and the Imperial pilot who defected. Cassian and Jin get their mission to find Saw Gerrera. That could lead them to finding Galen Erso to extract him and bring him back to the Senate to testify about the superweapon. Then this plot point is rendered moot just a minute later when Cassian gets pulled to the side by some general and is told, yeah, this isn't an extraction. Just kill Galen, but don't tell anybody else that this is the plan. So Jin and Cassian go to the planet called Jeddah. It's, really on the nose there. The Empire already showed up to stop the shipments from other cargo pilots before they end up destroying the main city on the planet, but I'm getting to the end a little too quickly again. When Saw Gerrera gets his hands on the pilot, he takes the message from Galen Erso, but still has the pilot tortured by an octopus-type alien because... What are you hiding, even though you've already given me everything you needed to give me? Yeah, this whole scene basically just turns into nothing but tentacle porn, so yay, Japanese market! Jin and Cassian run into Saw's rebels after they run into the Guardians of the Wills. Saw's rebels take both of them to Saw. Jin then sees the message that Galen said about how he put in a quote-unquote weakness into the Death Star that could blow the whole thing up. You know that really small exhaust port that was a 1 in a million shot that only Luke, a Force-sensitive individual, could hit? Yeah, that was an intentional flaw instead of just a last act of desperation before all the rebels get wiped out. Basically, the Empire launches a small test of the Death Star's weapon on the capital city, and Saw Gerrera decides to stay behind because, I'm tired of running away. He basically renders his importance to the plot completely moot after that one action. Also, Jin, quote-unquote, accidentally forgets to grab the hologram of Galen's message, so none of the Rebel Alliance will believe her, basically rendering the first, 45-50 minutes of this movie completely moot. The second part of the narrative is when the Rogue One crew goes to Edu to get Galen Erso from the Empire's lab and bring him back to the Rebel Alliance. The Rogue One crew crash lands and Cassian still carries out his mission to kill Galen Erso. Now, Krennic shows up to sniff out the person who leaked the info to the pilot that made him defect. Now, Galen admits to being the rat, but Krennic still goes, fuck it, I'm gonna kill all the scientists anyway for no other reason than just to be the irredeemable villain. And this is a move that, definitely is not gonna help out the Empire in the long run. And before Krennic can kill Galen, the rebels just all of a sudden just do a bombing run on the platform, killing only Galen, and Krennic basically walks away without a scratch. So why have Cassian and Andor be a sniper if you're just going to send in bombers? How did the rebels even know that Galen would be on the platform at that very moment that they did their bombing run? And I'll tell you how they knew, because of plot. Then Krennic goes to Vader's castle on Mustafar. Now, Vader's castle is nothing new to the Star Wars universe. This idea goes back to The Empire Strikes Back, but George Lucas held off on doing it back then because of the technological limitations of the late 70s, early 80s. Basically, Krennic failed the Empire, and Darth Vader force choked him, but he didn't kill Krennic, essentially making this whole plot point moot as a result. And it also made Darth Vader look like a little bitch, in my opinion, because he killed, a couple of admirals in Empire Strikes Back for failing at something smaller than what Krennic did. Under Krennic's control, the Death Star plans leaked, you had a rat in your midst, but he doesn't die at the hands of Darth Vader, and he gets to keep his position in the Empire on top of that. So part 3 of the narrative and the final part of the movie is the battle on Scarif, and this basically in a nutshell is just a ripoff of Return of the Jedi. There's a space battle where the Rebel fleet fights the Imperial fleet. Now how does Rogue One get onto Scarif? By using a stolen Imperial shuttle with an old coast to get past the planetary shield. Instead of a shield protecting an unfinished Death Star 2, it protects the entire planet with a gate that's one way in, one way out. Does this sound familiar? Because I'll tell you, it isn't from Star Wars. So they're not just ripping off Return of the Jedi, now they're ripping off Spaceballs. And before this happens, when all of the rebels went to Scarif, none of them could agree on anything. Jyn, Cassian, and the Rogue One crew get back, and Jyn tells them her father's message about the Death Star, and that he's planted a weakness, and basically to go steal the plans. Then a rebel then booms out, "Oh, why should we trust her? Her father was an Imperial scientist." Now, why in the fuck did the Rebel Lines capture Jyn in the very beginning and force her to work with them again? What was the whole goddamn point of this movie now? The first hour to hour and 20 minutes gets rendered completely moot at this fucking round table. So getting back to the battle on Scarif, because now it's a brand new movie, clean slate all over again. We had a clean slate after Saw Gerrera died, and we had a clean slate after Galen Erso died. So, fuck it. Okay, so back to the battle. Every character introduced in this movie is rendered completely irrelevant by this point. Everyone dies, including Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor, when they didn't even have to. They could have found another Imperial shuttle to take them off of Scarif, but instead, they just go down to the beach and lay there and talk until the nuclear blast from the Death Star just comes in and obliterates them. Let's talk about the Death Star blowing up their archives. So here's the question. How is the Empire able to build the Death Star 2 if they destroyed the archives, which contained the original plans, and they also killed their main architect? Galen Erso, along with all of their architects and scientists working under him. And this presents a huge gap in logic for the original trilogy, in my opinion. Also, Leia was apparently at the Battle of Scarif during this. It wasn't just a diplomatic mission to Alderaan. Why did they feel the need to put Leia at the Battle of Scarif? The plans were transmitted to the entire Rebel fleet that was there, meaning the plans could have been on 500 different ships at any one given time. So how did Darth Vader know that Leia's ship was the only one to contain the plans? I can go on and on about the various logical inconsistencies that this movie brings up, but I don't want to be here for 2 hours, and all of you probably don't want to hear me ramble about Rogue One for hours and hours on end. So how was Rogue One received at the time? Well, this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 84% based on 441 critic reviews and an audience score of 86% based on 104,419 audience reviews. And this movie has a Metacritic score of 65 based on 51 critic reviews and a user score of 7.6 out of 10 based on 3,316 ratings. Yeah, try saying that fast 3 times fast. This movie sits on IMDb at a 7.8 out of 10, and that's based on 533,067 reviews. This movie was made on a budget of $200 million, and it grossed $1,056,057,273 worldwide. Figures, I can say the bigger number, but I can't say the number that's in the thousands or the hundred thousands. This movie did a lot better than what most people thought it would do, keep in mind. Now, I remember the sentiment being that this movie was going to barely make its budget back because this was a non-episodic Star Wars movie. I believe Rogue One benefited from The Force Awakens being the return of Star Wars on the big screen. Now the fans are going to get to see how the Rebels retrieved the Death Star plans. But anyone could have played Star Wars Dark Forces and gotten that answer if they really were all that curious. I believe this movie is a rewriting of Star Wars lore to remove Kyle Katarn from existence. The problem with this being a rewrite of Star Wars lore is it makes certain moments in the original trilogy worse. It makes the opening of A New Hope worse because Leia was just on a diplomatic mission to Alderaan in the beginning. Nope, not anymore. We have to explain that, quote unquote, logical inconsistency because everything has to serve a fucking purpose now, even though no one had a problem with that explanation in the original movie. And this also extends to Return of the Jedi and how did the Death Star 2 get built so quickly if the Empire destroyed the archives with the plans of the original Death Star in them? Did they steal the plans back from the Rebels at some point between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back? Did they have a backup archive somewhere? What is it? This just raises more questions than answers. And film schools want to examine The Last Jedi for being a what not to do when writing. Why are they not examining this movie? Every plot point gets rendered moot by a future plot point in this movie, and every character is rendered inconsequential by the end. This is the definition of a what not to do in terms of storytelling. And the common defense for this approach is, well, they have to explain why all these characters are never ever talked about in future movies. All I have to say to that is, why did you even now bother making this movie? I can answer for how the Rebels stole the plans in the first 2 sentences of the opening crawl in A New Hope. All the writers did to the story of this movie was render it down to those first 2 sentences. So again, why bother making this movie if that's all you were going to ever do? And I have to come to the inevitable conclusion that Rogue One was simply just a cash grab. Hey, audience! Come see how the Rebels stole the Death Star plans. Just ignore the fact that we made every plot point moot and character inconsequential. Give us $1 billion for fucking free. Now with Rogue One out of the way, let's move on to the second Star Wars story movie, and that's Solo. And we're starting off with the creative team, as we always do. Now, this movie was originally directed by Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the guys that were behind the 21 Jump Street reboot with Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill, as well as the Lego Movie. Now, they had a history of turning really shit ideas for movies into gold. Now, they were fired from their positions with only 2 weeks left in principal photography. So, in English, they were fired at the last minute because of their style of letting the actors improvise, and that made poor old widow Johnny Kasdan cry. Oh, boo-hoo-hoo. So what ultimately happened with Solo after this? Well, it was ultimately directed by Ron Howard. Unlike Tony Gilroy from Rogue One, Ron Howard actually got the directing credit on this movie since he had to basically reshoot the entire thing mandated by Lucasfilm. So yeah, Lord and Miller's name isn't even on this thing anywhere. Now, most people know Ron Howard as the director of Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, The Da Vinci Code, Cinderella Man, and In the Heart of the Sea. But me personally, he will always be Richie Cunningham in my heart. Now, the 2 writers on this movie, you have Lawrence Kasdan. He got known for being one of the writers on The Empire Strikes Back. He also co-wrote Return of the Jedi with Lucas, Raiders of the Lost Ark. He did write The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston, Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, and Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, the video game that got turned into a couple of books and a comic book series at some point in the mid-90s. Then we get to Johnny Kasdan. Now, he's obviously Lawrence Kasdan's son. Surprise, surprise there, huh? Now, he has 5 writing credits to his name at the time of this recording. 2 TV shows, Freaks and Geeks and Dawson's Creek, 2 movies before Solo, both of which, personally, I've never heard of. One is called In the Land of Women, and the other one is called The First Time. Now let's move on to the character analysis of Solo, and we'll start off with the leading man, Alden Ehrenreich, as Han Solo. Now, I don't mind Alden Ehrenreich's take on Han Solo. I know that a lot of people were hoping for Anthony and Gruber to take over the role, since he already played a younger Harrison Ford in the movie The Age of Adeline, and he can pretty much do a spot-on impression of Harrison Ford. Now, I can't really complain about Han Solo not being as cool in this movie, because this is a prequel. I said this in my prequel trilogy analysis about Darth Vader and Boba Fett, but this also applies here. Everyone has to start somewhere. You don't just start out as a badass on day one, you have to build up to it. Then let's move on to Chewbacca, and with this character, they really missed a great opportunity to turn Chewbacca into a 3-dimensional character. Chewie and Han should have been more of an odd couple in the beginning, but in this movie, after they team up on the one job, they just stay together, no fuss, no muss, basically rendering him as Han's co-pilot before Han even got the Falcon. Then we get to Woody Harrelson as Beckett. Now, he's a smuggler that Han runs into after joining the Empire, and then he wants to run away with him. Beckett serves as more of a father figure to Han in the sense that he's giving him advice, like after the train job that goes horribly wrong. He doesn't want Han and Chewie to join him when dealing with Dryden Voss, because if Dryden Voss sees Han and Chewie, there's no leaving the smuggling life behind. You're in it. You're in it till the day you die. Now, toward the end of the movie, he becomes a turncoat and tells Dryden Voss the plan to screw him out of this precious resource. I can't remember the name of it to save my life, but it's not important. It's the MacGuffin for this movie. That's when Beckett reminds Han of his prior advice to never trust anybody. Okay. Then we move on to Emilia Clarke as Kira. Now, she's the love interest for Han Solo in this movie, and I don't mind that there's another love interest for Han because Leia couldn't have been the first girl that he met. Now, in the beginning, she's leaving Corellia with Han and then gets captured. Later in the movie, she's found to be a member of the Crimson Dawn, and that's a faction in this movie. So in English, they're basically a space gang. She eventually dethrones Dryden Voss and goes back to the leader of Crimson Dawn, Darth Maul. And Darth Maul is only here for fan service and nothing more. And I'll get into that more in a moment. Beckett does warn Han about Kira in the sense that she's a survivor, so don't think that she's going to be with you to the end, Han, type thing. Then we move on to Donald Glover as Lando Calrissian, and before I start with this character, just know that I am no fan of Donald Glover. So in this movie, he starts off as the smuggling pirate that we know in The Empire Strikes Back. He just doesn't have Cloud City yet. The biggest issue with Lando's character in this movie is they made him attracted to a fucking robot. Even in the press for this movie, Donald Glover was going on and on about how Lando is now a pansexual because, well, simply, how can you not be a pansexual in the Star Wars universe? So Lando went from being the coolest cat in the galaxy and the smooth talker with the ladies to now he just wants to bang a droid's brains out. Now you have to wonder if he really had any feelings for Lobot and Empire. That must have made for some interesting nights on Cloud City. What happens on Cloud City stays on Cloud City, if you know what I mean. Now, I'm not a fan of putting modern identity politics in movies because typically it always backfires, and it ages the movie in the process. If anybody watches this, 5 to 10 years from now, they're going to be looking at it going, what the fuck? Then we have Phoebe Waller-Bridge as L337, and this is the droid that Lando is attracted to in this movie by L337's own words. Kira asks how is it even possible to have an intimate relationship with a droid, and L337's response is, well, it can happen. But her character is all about droids' rights. What is it I said about putting modern identity politics into movies? You didn't hear C-3PO and R2-D2 complain when they were thrown out of the cantina in A New Hope because the sentiment from Luke was, hey, we better not cause any trouble here. We better not cause any trouble here. And 3PO and R2 was like, okay, and just waited outside. Why was that the mantra? Because the people in the cantina probably had no problem shooting you where you stood if you crossed them the wrong way. Now back to L337, she eventually gets blasted to all hell on Kessel, and Lando and eventually Han and Chewie sacrifice their lives to save this droid because she's got the best navigation computer in her system. Then we have Paul Bettany as Dryden Voss. Now he's the guy that Beckett and Han deal with in terms of the Crimson Dawn. He isn't the head of the organization, but he's up there. Kira is his lieutenant, and I won't even say that he's really the villain of this movie, because he's only shown in a couple of scenes for this movie. The first of which is when Han and Beckett get the job to go to Kessel, and the second time is when Han tries to screw him out of the deal. Now, I'm not going to say that he's the bad guy, because try screwing someone out of a good amount of money and see whether or not they turn violent on you. This is someone who was forced into the villain role as a result, and here's a fun fact. Dryden Voss was originally supposed to be played by Michael Kenneth Williams. Most of you may remember him as Omar Little on The Wire, but Ron Howard couldn't get him back to do the reshoot, so he had to replace him with Paul Bettany. And finally, we get to Aaron Kellyman as Enfys Nest. Now, this character is a masked villain and is a genuine adversary for Han Solo. This character is pretty decent at combat, but this is Disney Star Wars, and we all know Disney Star Wars loves to unmask their masked villains. So this really begs the question, why didn't Enfys Nest have a mask if Enfys Nest was going to get unmasked just later on? Anyways, after Enfys Nest gets unmasked, it's revealed that Enfys Nest is a woman, BFD, and for those of you who don't know, that basically just means big fucking deal. She then turns from villain to ally because she doesn't want the Crimson Dawn to get their hands on that precious resource because of some heartfelt speech about how the Crimson Dawn was going to use it for their own gain, yada, yada, yada. But we as the audience are supposed to believe that Enfys Nest won't use it for her own gain. Why, if she was your main villain for the majority of this movie, would you even take this character's word for it? Now let's move on to the narrative analysis portion of Solo. Now this movie is a prequel, obviously, and I stated in my prequel trilogy analysis that in order to do a proper prequel, you have to bring something new to the table in terms of the character development. What was done in this movie as far as that? Well, everything you already knew about Han Solo was in this movie. Lando got his sexuality changed for no other reason than just to change it, because modern identity politics, and Chewbacca is just here. This movie feels more like a greatest hits album of your favorite rock bands, such as Aerosmith or Dokken. Well, in my case, Dokken, you've probably never heard of them. As a result, this movie comes off as if someone is checking off the boxes of a to-do list. Han meets Chewie? Check. Han meets Lando? Check. Millennium Falcon does the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs? Check. Han wins the Falcon, quote-unquote, fair and square? Check. We already knew all this information in the original trilogy. It was all told in A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. And this movie also has a real villain problem, just like Rogue One did, but this movie has a different problem than what Rogue One had. Rogue One had the irredeemable villain, the one that just kicks the dog just to kick the dog. In Solo, the filmmakers don't want to commit to a villain. Is it Enfys Nest? Well, by the end of the movie, we had an answer of no, even though Enfys Nest was being built as the villain. Is it Dryden Voss? By the end of the movie, yes, but he didn't start off as the villain. He was only shown as the guy who gave Han the job to go to Kessel to get the precious resource, and then Han wants to screw him out of the money. Is it Beckett? No, because Han kills Beckett at the very end of this movie, and his heel turn just comes out of nowhere. So, technically by the end of the movie, yes, but it's like, okay, why are we making Beckett the villain again? Well, we need a villain. If this movie were to ever get a sequel, which I highly doubt it ever will, okay, Beckett is dead, Enfys Nest turns out not to be a villain, and Dryden Voss is dead. The only person left standing in the Crimson Dawn that we know is Qi'ra, and I don't even believe that Qi'ra would even become a villain in the second movie. I believe that she would be more of a femme fatale for Han, and the problem with that is, Han has no reason to go for Qi'ra, because Qi'ra willingly stayed in the Crimson Dawn instead of faking her death and running away with Han. Now, the last big problem with this movie narratively is it was set up to be a trilogy, not just a one-off story like Rogue One. That's why Darth Maul is at the end of this movie. It teases events to come. Now, what those events are, I don't know. I wish that Darth Maul could just be removed from this movie, that way Qi'ra could run off with Han, and then the sequel can have a time jump where it's revealed that Darth Maul is running the show. Right? That didn't have to be shown in the first movie at all. Just like I said, it's only there to tease the sequels. Whatever happened to the days of just making a good first movie and then making the sequels later? Imagine if the original Star Wars did this, where the attack on the Death Star was planned at the end of the first movie, but the plan wouldn't be carried out until The Empire Strikes Back. I believe there would have never been an Empire Strikes Back if George Lucas started to pull this shit back in the late 70s. Now, how was Solo received? Well, this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 70% based on 466 critic reviews and an audience score of 63% based on 43,706 audience reviews. This movie has a Metacritic score of 62 based on 54 critic reviews and a user score of 6.1 out of 10 based on 1,674 ratings. Woohoo! I can pronounce numbers again! This movie sits on IMDb at 6.9 out of 10 based on 272,732 reviews, and this movie had a reported budget of $275 million, and it only grossed $392,924,807 worldwide, effectively making this Star Wars' first ever financial bomb. Now, this movie probably would have still made less than The Last Jedi. I'm not denying that. But Disney basically made two movies for the price of one because of one unproven writer's ego, that's John Kasdan, using Daddy to get the directors fired because, well, they're not sticking to my script word for word. And this movie could have still made money had Lord and Miller not been fired 2 weeks before principal photography was supposed to wrap. As a result of the firing of Lord and Miller that late, this movie had to make more than Rogue One just to break even at the box office. That was never going to happen even before The Last Jedi came out and pissed off the fan base. And the common thing I hear about Solo is it failed because of The Last Jedi. And I agree with The Last Jedi playing a role at the box office performance of this movie to a degree. I believe that the audience was losing faith in Disney's Star Wars by this point, and you can look at the difference between The Force Awakens and Rise of Skywalker and see an almost 50% loss by the end of the sequel trilogy. Now, I believe Solo had a lot of problems in production, and Lord and Miller were fired in June of 2017. That was a whole 6 months before The Last Jedi even came out. The sentiment online amongst fans at that time were just pull the plug. After Ron Howard was announced to take over as director, it came out that Disney was unhappy with Alden Ehrenreich, their lead actor. They hired an acting coach after Lord and Miller were fired. Now, it's important to note that it's not uncommon to have an acting coach on a movie set, but it is rather unusual when an acting coach is hired with only 2 weeks left of principal photography. Also, like I said, Paul Bettany had to come in to replace Michael K. Williams as Dryden Voss because Michael K. Williams couldn't commit to the reshoots. And I have to ask again, why was this movie not pulled with all the behind-the-scenes drama that occurred long before The Last Jedi even came out? Look at how much money John Kasdan's ego coupled with Kathy Kennedy's costed the Walt Disney Company. And I am not meaning to turn this into a, oh, boo-hoo, look, poor Walt Disney Company. No, they're pieces of shit, too, in my opinion. There's a reason why Disney took more of a hands-on approach after Solo. The only thing that this movie really accomplished was it was Star Wars' first financial bomb ever. Since I'm talking about both movies in this episode, I'm going to also bring up some overlapping critiques that I have of both movies. So this is what both the movies share. Basically, there's no opening crawl. Both movies do start with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So let's start with Rogue One. The entire opening of that movie could have been explained away in an opening crawl and then open the movie showing Jyn in the Imperial prison. The first 8 minutes could have been condensed to 2.5 with just an opening crawl. Then we get to Solo, and there is text on the screen saying, "It is a lawless time. People are fighting over this particular resource." I'm thinking the entire time I'm watching this, why is there no opening crawl, even though the text is there on the screen to set the stage? In Solo, they wanted to have the opening crawl without having the opening crawl. Now, why do I bring this up? Because the opening crawl is a part of the aesthetics to a Star Wars movie. If you're going to have a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, then follow it up with the opening crawl in the title music. This may seem small, but when you're making a movie in an established franchise with specific aesthetics, and you don't use the aesthetics for this particular franchise, then the fans have the right to complain about it. They have the right to say it doesn't feel like a Star Wars movie, and from an aesthetic standpoint, they're not wrong. Most of the Star Wars video games have an opening crawl to some degree when you play their single-player campaigns, with the exception of a couple of them. I know one of them is a Star Wars Republic Commando, but it wouldn't have worked for Star Wars Republic Commando. Now, both, and the other overlapping critique is that both movies feel very inconsequential, and both movies do this in different ways. Rogue One, every plot point renders itself moot by future plot points within the movie, and every character becomes inconsequential to the overall universe because the characters are written in ways that make them inconsequential. Now, Solo, with this being a prequel, nothing was done to enhance Han Solo as a character. Everything that's in this movie is a piece of information that we already know because of the original trilogy. The new characters of Kira, Enfys Nest, and Dryden Voss and Beckett render themselves useless throughout the movie because of a lack of direction on the villains for the movie. In short, this movie by the end feels like a waste of time. That doesn't mean it's poorly written. It doesn't mean it's a piece of shit. Solo is definitely better than Rogue One. At least in Solo, none of the characters really render themselves inconsequential, with the exception of Enfys Nest and the other villains. That's only one character compared to every new character introduced in Rogue One. With this series of movies, we got one that was purely plot-driven, that was Rogue One, and that was terribly written. And we got one that was more of a character drama, and that was Solo. This is actually not the first time we've actually seen expanded universe movies in Star Wars either. Who remembers the Ewok movies from the 1980s? There were two of those movies. The first one was Caravan of Courage and Ewok Adventure, and this one takes place between Empire and Return of the Jedi, and its sequel was called Ewoks: The Battle for Endor. Now, only the first movie was released to theaters, and that was only in Europe, not the United States. In the US, they were basically made for TV movies. When I first heard that Disney is also going to make expanded universe movies on top of episodic movies, it didn't shock me because I remember the Ewoks movies and even the Droids animated series on top of that. Who remembers all that from the 80s? And I'll end the episode off with this. I believe that the Star Wars story series was a real letdown. Instead of telling new stories with new characters that just happens to be set in the universe of the Empire versus Rebels, or Trade Federation versus Republic, or First Order versus Resistance, everything had to tie into the original trilogy. This killed any potential that this series of movies had. Let's say theoretically that a one-off standalone movie worked so well with the audience that it warranted its own series of episodic movies. A Star Wars story banner could have been the experimental branch to Star Wars to tell new stories with new characters and get potentially new movie series out of this. But instead, Lucasfilm, headed by Kathy Kennedy, had to make two movies that played into nothing but fan service, where one movie's plot and characters were rendered inconsequential, and the other movie, a prequel about a pre-existing character, had to contain all the information that we as fans already knew about him from those original trilogy movies. These Star Wars story movies could have been printing Disney money for years and years and years to come. Now, not every movie released under this banner would have been a hit, and not every movie released under this banner would have even warranted a sequel. Some stories are just meant to be one-offs and you're done. There probably would have been quite a few one-off stories that maybe would get expanded in the novels, comics, or video games. Unfortunately, with Lucasfilm and Disney mishandling of the Star Wars franchise, I believe it's going to be a long time before anyone is willing to give the movies another go-round. Yes, The Mandalorian does exist to great fanfare, but that's the exception. Whenever I see a Star Wars story banner, all I have to think is what a wasted potential, because then Disney and Lucasfilm wouldn't have to do episode 10, 11, 12, 15, 22, 46, so on and so forth. They could have just done their own thing. Instead, they just wanted to milk nostalgia for a bunch of money in the short term that costed them lifelong fans in the long term.